Hi, Ashanthi. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Anab. Great to see you.
And you, yeah. I just thought we could start this conversation, by if you don't mind introducing yourself.
My name is Eshanthi Ranasinghe. I am you could say, futurist and funder in social impact. And, I came into this work at Omidyar Network, where I was running an exploration and future sensing unit that was really interested in anticipating future trends, ways the world was going to change, and really using that information to build a better future that worked for everyone. Now I'm at TED, Audacious Project, but very much in the same spirit of things, looking for great innovations out there to build a better world.
The work you're doing is really about supporting social impact projects that can sort of alter the way things are now. And I think that's where we started working with you at Omidyar whilst you were still at Omidyar. And so I just wondered whether you want to talk about the framing of the project that led to the final outcome that we produced, called The Intersection of Film.
The Futures is kind of a weird and wild and wonderful subject with lots of different people who do it in different ways. We are particularly interested in thinking about who the future is really serving. So rather than just looking at it from the lens of, okay, here are some trends, what could result, questioning whose trends are we looking at, whose voices are we listening to, who is in the world that is actually not included in the futures that we often imagine, and how do we actually change that focus entirely so that the people who are sort of most at the margins or most living in between worlds or identities can be in the driver's seat of building and imagining the future that that we think about when we fund our work or when we build amazing projects with people like you. And when you start to think about what could happen next, you often automatically filter for the voices that are most heard. So maybe it's an expert on the news, or somebody, a famous author, or maybe it's someone who's an investor, investors, tech creators. And you realize very quickly, this is a very narrow part of the world. But actually it is the world it is the group of people who most decides what our future is going to be, maybe because of the infrastructure that we build, the new technologies that we come up with. But there's a real question about, should that be, is that really what it should be? And what if we put different people really intentionally in the driver's seat? And in reality, by the way, none of those people who imagine and build, say new technologies, they do not build the future, really. Really, it is built by all of us. And we're often surprised by the results because regular people take on technologies, regular people interact with them, and then we change them in the course of that. So what if we actually looked at the group of people building the future, thinking about the future, imagining the future very intentionally at the beginning? What would they actually create? The reason we wanted to work with you all in particular on this was we wanted to think about technology, but in the context of culture and political shifts and social shifts, and really think about power as part of that.
That was the premise of the original brief, and using the idea of ambient technologies to drive home the point that ambient technologies such as VR and augmented reality and all these kinds of, and now the metaverse and all these digital augmented technologies, can they be more democratic? Can we imagine alternative, hopeful features around these technologies? That was the kind of starting point. And it's interesting to see that we started off during the first lockdown, just before COVID, and how that brief evolved because of everything that was happening in 2020.
Originally, what we wanted to do was acknowledge reality while being optimistic in how the future could unfold. And I want to emphasize acknowledge reality, acknowledge history, acknowledge social context. We didn't want a utopia which erases all the challenges that we face as humans with each other, with our planet. But we wanted it in context. Okay, so technology, we know at a minimum, as we watched from laptops to smart devices, we've really watched this evolution of technology and the way it's changed us as people in a society, just as we've even moved just from the simple screen on our desk to something accessible in our hand. It's completely changed the way we interact with technology.
Mm-hmm.
And then trying to think, okay, we know there are more smart devices. We know there are smart spaces, smart cities being built. So actually the technology is moving to around us into our actual space and into our bodies. We knew this. So that is one of those trends that you can mark. You can kind of just define we see this shift occurring. There are many companies working on this, and there's a lot of money to be made. So there is something reinforcing that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's just outside of the context of culture and people, though. That's just a thing that's happening. Mm-hmm. Then 2020 ushered in major shifts in our life that has really nothing to do with anything that we could control immediately. A global pandemic, some serious economic fallout from that, huge groups of people losing jobs, losing access to each other, social isolation and distancing, changes to our health and our bodies that we had to really reckon with on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. And then the political fallout of that, when you see that type of destabilization occurring in in a very personal way for people, that results in a political destabilization. And actually a lot of groups also, because of technology, who were able to use information around the pandemic to further destabilize politics if they wanted to, for their own means, mm-hmm. their own ends. And we saw political destabilization. Then we saw a real reckoning around race, especially in the US, but actually globally around power. Who gets access to these resources? Who is in the driver's seat? And then who is attacked? Who is it's so confusing to think of these things, because normally you wouldn't think of race intersecting with health, but actually that is exactly what happens when you have people who don't get the same access to resources or protections. And then especially here, when we saw, the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. And the thing about all of this context in the US is that that type of thing, unfortunately, has been happening for hundreds of years. There's nothing new really about people of color, Black people in particular, being attacked by institutions of power like the police. That's unfortunately that's a lived reality that many people have had for a long time. But now here we are sitting in our homes, mm-hmm. on our computers, really nothing else to do, frankly, and really in the media and in social media in particular. And we're just actually paying attention. Everyone is paying attention. The world is paying attention. Mm-hmm. And you have this massive organization of protests and people who are saying, no, we have to stop this. And then people from different backgrounds actually identifying and recognizing that this was happening, and not just a small pocket of community members who can see it, but the whole world seeing it. Yeah. And so suddenly we have a completely new context. And this was happening as you all were doing the research on these trends and trying to place all of this into a film and a storyline. And let's not forget climate change occurring. Also another thing that's been happening for a very long time. Yeah. But we saw wildfires break out up and down the West Coast. We saw climate events across the world. And when you have, all of these things have happened, but when you have this additional thing of a massive pandemic, it's like, everything was coming at the same time. And the world really felt very uncertain. And it didn't really feel like it was enough to think about technology on its own anymore. We really had to place it in the context of change. Yeah. And, even though I think we knew, okay, some of this will stabilize at some point, I think there was something really important about the fact that we created this in a moment where it was so dynamic and so uncertain that we really had to really capture what was uncertain in the film.
You shouldered this expansive work and quite political within an organization, which at that point we were looking at technology. And so not just internally, but in your mind and with your colleagues, what were the sort of conversations you were having to be able to support this nature of work?
Alongside the change that was occurring in our lives and in the world, we were also changing a lot of the work we were doing, which was good. I think in a lot of ways, there was flexibility to adapt. Is that it was not surprising to anyone that we folded in these additional narratives. Now, the story itself becomes a lot more complex, just as reality is really actually complex. And it's not as simple as, okay, here's just the strand of technology, and here are a couple of provocations about where it could go, and that's enough. Now let's have a conversation about it. Now we've really gotten a lot more into that storyline. So I would say, certainly there was this kind of moment when we were going through different versions of the film, just editing it with really, you all were editing it. We were just sort of supplying comments where people were really like, wow, I'm almost overwhelmed. Like, I don't know what to do with this information. I don't know what to do with this amount of change. What I was really encouraged is to see that we had, as we showed snippets, we showed the whole thing internally as we shared it with a few folks in our networks. A lot of interesting conversations came up for them that they would have with their organizations, just asking, okay, what do we actually do? Let's just wade into this uncertainty and just, what if we woke up in this world? It's not unrealistic at all. It's actually very highly realistic. What would we do if that were the reality we were in?
And for those who haven't seen the film, you can watch the intersection on YouTube or on our website, superflux.in. And doing this kind of work requires a lot of courage. And now you're in a new organization helping shape their funding program. What is it that drives you to do the work you do?
I think a lot of this type of work to me is about my own personal identity, and just often feeling, even with all the privilege I have, feeling left out of stories and futures and narratives. I mean, I wasn't a futurist by any means. I barely called myself that. When I came to a mid-air network, I was in strategy, funding, that type of thing, and social impact, of course. And the futures was a way to really just anticipate. That's the way I originally thought of it. And then I quickly realized, well, when people are anticipating, as I met futurists and I went to different rooms with people imagining futures, oh, this is a very small group of people in the end, and this is a very homogenous group of people, and I'm not even in this room, and I'm very, very privileged. So how is that? If I'm not in this room, then 99% of the world is not in this room, is not represented in this room. So what are we doing here? Are we building a world that we actually want to leave behind? And so for me, being able to shine a light on people who live at sort of intersections of identities or in the margins was really a personal one also.
I think this is a really lovely note to end our conversation on, and really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.